And Budde thought that there was a better way to do this. He thought that a district would operate more efficiently and get better results for kids if teachers had the opportunity to run schools themselves. So what Budde proposed was really decentralizing the school district by allowing for groups of teachers to operate schools within the district under fixed term contracts. So that's where the term charter came from, was those fixed term contracts that Budde had proposed.
You're listening to the Bold by Choice podcast with Vashanta Harris and Jim Gunner. Real talk about charter schools, from the boardroom to the classroom, powered by the National Charter Schools Institute.
Well, friends, welcome back to the Bold by Choice podcast, where we explore the roots, the revolutions, and the realities of the charter school movement. I'm Vashanta Harris.
And I'm Jim Gunner. This season, we're traveling through time to understand where the charter idea came from, why it matters, and what it means for public education today.
And we are joined not only today, but this entire season by two incredible thinkers and leaders and movement builders who know this history and have lived this history firsthand. Welcome in Don Cooper and Ember Reichgott-Young. Welcome to season 2.
Well, thank you. Congratulations on the podcast.
Thank you. We're super excited. It was a little bit nerve-wracking when we launched. I won't lie about that. It was like, wait, we're really doing this? It's really happening. And now it's public. And I hope that our reception stays as warm as it's begun.
So, Shanta, what was the biggest challenge in season 1?
I would say scheduling, which I kind of thought it would be. Everyone is so amazing. And they're also very busy because lots of folks like to benefit from their expertise. So I think the scheduling piece was the biggest challenge in my perspective. Jim, what do you think?
Scheduling logistics, but Vashanta has absolutely rocked it. Her preparation and planning. And I'll tell you, one of the greatest things of season 1 is season 1 was complete before the first episode was dropped.
I was going to say, I think the biggest challenge is going back 30 years and trying to remember everything that happened. But we can do it.
Well, this is why we call it Legacy Lessons. And Ember, you are bold by choice. 30 years ago, you were a Democrat Minnesota state senator that introduced the nation's first charter school law. And you got it passed. Tell us about that.
Well, it was actually 34 years ago to be exact, Jim. It was a 3-year process. In the end, it was bipartisan. People from the middle basically got together to pass it. It was very compromised. I was not very happy with it when it passed. I thought a charter school would never, ever happen. But we know that it was the beginning. And thank God, 34 years later, it's in 48 states.
That's right. And Don, you've done an incredible amount of research around the charter movement itself. We'd love to hear a little bit about your experience in this content area as well.
No, it's been a great experience, and we've talked about this before, Vashanta, but I'm not a teacher, so I came to the charter movement a little differently than most people have. I've always come from the kind of the policy, the legal, the regulatory stance, and to me, it's just been fascinating to see how one idea in Minnesota has traveled through the states, has changed, has evolved, has become better over time to be able to help millions of kids today.
And readers, I want you all to know, in preparing for season 2, being able to sit with Jim, Don, and Ember brought me a lot of understanding. And they gave me some homework. So there were some articles and a book I had to read. And so I buckled down a couple weeks ago to really make sure that I was caught up enough on the material to be able to talk with you guys. And there was a piece on Ray Budde and the charter school concept. That was an article I think, Don, you sent over to me. And there was a part of it that really stuck out. And I'm going to quote this. I'd written it in my notes. And here's the quote. It says, "It is time to put teachers in charge of schools. We give them responsibility for a group of students. We tell them what curriculum to use, but we do not let them decide how to run their own schools." And I had highlighted that when I was doing my reading. And that came from Ray Budde in 1988, planting a seed. And that seed was basically what would later become chartering that we talk about today. And I was really intrigued about Ray. It seemed like he started out like many of us in schools, and he was a school administrator. And from my research, he seemed to be a remarkably thoughtful person. In 1974, he had published a paper also suggesting that there was this local school board and they might give a group of teachers a very unique opportunity. And that opportunity would be to operate a school under the contract, or what we later started calling it charters. And so I wanted to start out with this concept. And Don, my first question is for you. So before he became known for this kind of groundwork in the charter idea, who was Ray Budde and what shaped his thinking?
Sure. Great question. And Vashanta, you're exactly right. Like so many people in the charter movement today, his background was in education. He was started out as a classroom teacher in English, later was a middle school principal right here in East Lansing, where he was studying at Michigan State to earn his doctorate, and then went to the University of Massachusetts Amherst as a professor. Over in their newly restructured School of Education. So he was always someone who was very thoughtful. He approached his work like a teacher would approach it. And he was really interested in organizational change. So how districts could operate better and put teachers in more of a leadership position than they were in historically.
Don, talk to us about when he first laid out his proposal. What exactly was he suggesting, and who did he hope would actually take action?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jim. And this is something a little different than how we think about chartering today. So when Budde first laid out his proposal in 1974, he was approaching it as a way to reorganize the school district. So districts at the time had, similar today, had central offices. A lot of decisions were made centrally, and teachers were expected to implement them as their frontline administrators within schools, as the ones who are doing things. And Budde thought that there was a better way to do this. He thought that a district would operate more efficiently and get better results for kids if teachers had the opportunity to run schools themselves. So what Budde proposed was really decentralizing the school district by allowing for groups of teachers to operate schools within the district under fixed term contracts. So that's where the term charter came from, was those fixed term contracts that Budde had proposed originally. So that's kind of the origin of the term. But again, this is kind of a key difference between where we're at today and where Budde started out. He was looking at this from the district approach, not from the new schools approach on things. It evolved over time, and I know we're going to be talking about that to get to the new schools approach, but just a little bit of a different framing of his concept of this.
This teacher-led leadership was so important, and today is one of the biggest innovations of chartering, teacher-powered schools. That is an innovation that came out of chartering, and actually Ray Budde did the seeds for that years and years ago. So we might talk about that in a later podcast, but the idea of teachers actually running schools is actually happening today.
It also strikes me as the limitations on our thinking, right? And no criticism of Budde, but in 1974, the only way to think about making schools better was through the district, because that was the only public education game in town. And as we fast forward to the evolution of the charter idea, it was, could somebody besides the district, somebody beyond the district, do something? So let's get into that. Ember, in the essay, there's a quote I'd like to elevate. The Citizens League made a deliberate choice. It would define a new state strategy. What was the Citizens League, and what was this idea, and why did you run with it?
So the Citizens League was a Minnesota treasure, as the newspaper called it. It was a nonpartisan group of civic, labor, business, and educational leaders. They didn't have an agenda. They didn't have an ideology. It was truly a group about good government. And it had created some stunning legislative successes in previous years that were breakthroughs in delivery of government services, like regional tax-based sharing and regional coordination of services, which coordinated dozens of local governments. Well, here's the deal. The media said that the League had been more successful as an instrument of change than any organization in the state. If you wanted a breakthrough, If you wanted something different to happen, you don't look to teacher groups or labor or political parties. You look to the league for generating new ideas. And they would work on these issues with in-depth research and experts over months. Now, this particular report on chartering took over 9 months. So this was a serious effort, and that's why it was so pivotal. So when it was introduced by the Citizens League, people paid attention.
That's incredible. And forgive my way of terming this, but when I think about the Citizens League, it really sounds like a think tank, right? Like you get some folks together across various organizations, various types of work, businesses, and they're coming together to really think of ideas. And once there was one that the group was like, yep, let's take it and run with it, they continued to work together to develop it jointly so that it can then go through the legislative process and eventually allow the laws to become created. And that was really inspiring for me to read about because I think about how we operate today, and Jim and I and our team have these conversations of sometimes it is just important for us to get in a room with all of our differences and perspectives and talk to each other versus sometimes we kind of talk in our silos. I was really inspired to see how the league was coordinated and then the work that the league took on as well.
You're right. We need much more of that today. In not just education, but in all of the government delivery of services.
And Don, my next question is for you. Later, Ray kind of writes about chartering all schools in his book, Strengthen School-Based Management by Chartering All Schools. What was he getting at, and what limitations in the system was he trying to address?
Great question. So let's go back in time a little bit first. So Budde first proposed the idea of charter schools back in 1974 in a paper that he wrote for a conference. And at the time, it really didn't get much of a reception. It was just kind of an idea that he put out there and nothing really happened with it. Fast forward about 5 years, A Nation at Risk is published about the crisis in America's public schools. And one of the solutions that A Nation at Risk proposed was increasing the quality and professionalism of the teacher workforce. So Budde refreshed his paper at that point in time and republished it in 1988. And then later in the 90s, published the book that you had mentioned. And what he was going for the entire time was how to take all schools within a district and transition a district from the top-down centralized bureaucracy that we often think of with a school district, where there's a superintendent in a central office that are making decisions on behalf of schools, you know, the people who are the farthest away from the kids, and creating a new structure in which teachers are in charge and teachers are leading the day-to-day operations and have more professional decisions about schools. So in his 1988 paper, he had proposed, I believe it was a 10-year period that a district could transition to that. 96 was a little more of an evolution of his thinking where he was able to shorten the time period on that. But that was really his ultimate goal, was to take the district and transition it from that top-down centralized bureaucracy that we think of as school districts today in more of, what a lot of places would call portfolios of schools as well, a portfolio district. And, just with that, it's important to note that there were districts that were trying this approach throughout the nation. New York in the 1970s and 1980s, the Harlem districts under Seiflegel were working on more site-based management and autonomy. Right here in our home state of Michigan, Detroit was experimenting with what we'd call chartering within the district. Debbie McGriff was superintendent of the district at the time. There were a few others who were really taking this idea and going with it, but nobody ever really got to the scale that Budde had thought of.
And Don, I love that you gave a shout out to Debbie McGriff, because there were these precursors to chartering that really helped lay the groundwork. It's just interesting to, read and hear and educate people about these visionaries and their ideas and how they're ignored at first, not taken seriously, and then things evolve and happen, and all of a sudden these ideas take root and flourish and help reshape the system.
Jim, sometimes there are three phases of policy we go to. The first is it's never going to get passed. The second is it's never going to get funded. And the third is I was for it all along. And, and a lot of us have been through all three of those phases in different ways.
I love that, Don. You got it. You nailed it.
So, Ember, you were one of those that took on the Citizens League report and turned it into action with a law. You were a bit of a visionary, and you've told the story that when that law passed, you cried. Take us back, and what was going on?
Well, as I alluded to, these ideas were way before. Ray Budde's ideas were way before. And this idea of turning the school district upside down and eliminating the top down and taking it from the bottom up, the schools being the vehicles and their teachers leading the way, was pretty radical. So nobody took that seriously, and no one recognized that there was a problem significant enough in our system to require such restructuring. So to them, the system was working just fine. There was no outcry from our constituents to say, change the system. They no need to respond. So, so it was hard to pass this, and people didn't understand why I was trying to pass this. And so it just kept getting more compromised, and we can go into the details of that later. But the bottom line is, when it finally got to the conference committee, the very last time it was voted on, the final vote, in my view, it was so compromised that a charter school would never happen. And so I left that room and I was just in tears. I felt like all the work I had done for 3 years was just going to go down the drain. And so I just felt this was done. And then even worse than that, when I left the room, I heard the teachers' lobbyists talking to each other, saying they were going to kill it on the House floor. And I thought, what are you going to kill? There's nothing left. So I was devastated the next morning, and I called it the morning after, because I just felt like it was just such a letdown for 3 years of work.
And there's a few characters and persons that played a role. And there's one I want to center our attention on for this next segment. And his name is Al Shanker. And there's a anchor text that we're using. And for listeners, we'll have links to all of our anchor text and videos for you all to check out on your own. But this one that we are talking about at this moment is from the National Press Club speech in 1988. And there on page 5, there's a particular quote I'd like to enter for our discussion. And it says, however, I think that the response to reform and the nature of the reform are both leading us toward a very dangerous situation. It later goes on to say the response to reform is an attack on teachers. And that was Al Shanker in 1988. And his message was becoming very clear. The reform movement wasn't, in his view, kind of missing the mark, but it was hurting the very people responsible for carrying it out. And I want to explore what Shanker saw, what he proposed, and why this particular moment began to shift the conversation.
Not everybody's been to the National Press Club, but you don't go there to say something not of import. So talk to us.
Yeah.
What's Al Shanker leading, and why does his voice at the National Press Club matter?
Yeah, you're exactly right on that. So Al Shanker was the president of the American Federation of Teachers, and is the leader of one of the nation's largest labor unions. He was more than just an organizer. He really was a visionary.
Now that's Randy Weingarten today, correct?
That's right. Yep, that's right. That's Randy Weingarten today. So a little bit of a different approaches than Weingarten takes on things. But Shanker was looking for a solution. Again, you got to go back to the early 1980s and think about the context that we're operating in with a nation at risk. And a nation at risk really did mobilize the nation's policymakers, researchers, teachers to start finding new and better ways to improve quality within schools. And Shanker wanted to be in that conversation and was a leading voice in that conversation. So in 1988, he had proposed the idea of charter schools. This is the first time when the idea of charter schools really makes it to the big stage. And that's what the National Press Club is the big stage. And after his speech, he was able to publish a column on it in his New York Times column, better outlining the proposal of it. But to really understand Al Shanker, you really have to read Rich Kahlenberg's book on him. So I'd just like to read kind of a little bit of a passage from Kahlenberg's book to explain a little bit about Shanker's thinking in chartering. Shanker argued that a top-down reform movement that left basic factory model in place was working for perhaps 15 to 25% of students, but a bottom-up restructuring of education was required for the other 80% who do not learn well in a traditional school setting. Many students are not able to sit quietly and listen to others talk for 5 hours a day, he said. Quote, most adults can't do it. Most kids can't do it. Some of these students might, in fact, be very bright. He argued, quote, when we say to kids is either you will learn one way by sitting there and listening to me, or otherwise we're going to label you as being stupid and we'll give you a bad marks. So that's kind of what he was trying to approach in this, is how do we change the system so it becomes more responsive for kids, better for kids? And his take on charters was to take Ray Budde's idea of allowing teachers with greater site-based autonomy and the ability to run schools, but doing something a little different with it. So where Ray Budde proposed allowing teachers to operate existing schools, Shanker proposed allowing teachers to open new schools in existing school buildings, to be able to innovate, try new things, reach those 80% of kids who aren't responding to the traditional top-down model. Like Budde, he proposed it would be under a form of a contract. That's where he borrowed the term chartering from. Would operate under a fixed period of time to see what's working and what's not. But again, this was a very bottom-up approach by empowering teachers to do new and different things to help get results for kids.
That just resonated with me when you mentioned the percentage of students that the system at that time may have not been reaching. That just was a very sobering moment. And Ember,
what's even more sobering, Vashant, is we've been working at this 30 or 34 years, and there's still about 80% of the kids that aren't having super success. And so that he said the system's working for 15 to 20% in 1980-ish. And here we are today in 2025, and we're still like, the system doesn't work for most kids. We've got some serious reflections and challenges ahead of us.
Yeah, and just another quote from Shanker on this that I think is really important. He said, right, students who are struggling in school, quote, you have to be like a doctor. If the medicine doesn't work, he doesn't bawl the hell out of you because you didn't respond to his pill. You've got to try a variety of new things, end quote. So that's kind of what chartering was in his construct. His idea of reform was allowing teachers to try new things in order to get better results for kids and elevating the professionalism of the teaching workforce in doing so. So really a visionary, really ahead of his time. I think everyone's got to have great admiration for the courage that would take him to maybe step out in front of his membership in some ways, which might have had other interests, to propose such a bold idea that eventually took off.
That's right. And Ember, and listening and reading to your book, you talk about this early energy and giving teachers the freedom to lead schools, even though the details were still being developed at that time. There were some elements that began to resonate. How did that thinking make its way from places like Shanker's national stage, right, at the National Press Club, into the specific space that you all lived and worked in Minnesota?
Well, first of all, Don is just exactly right that Al Shanker was a reformer, a visionary. People don't often think of union leaders that way, but he was. And I have really admired that as I've learned more about him over the years. So he was a reformer and therefore invited to come to a seminar in Minnesota in 1988 called the Itasca Conference. And we had just passed open enrollment in Minnesota, where a child could go to any public school district across border lines. And so we were thinking, what's the next step? Where do we go from here? And he was the reformer that was asked to speak. And when I heard him at the Itasca seminar, along with some of my other legislative colleagues, I heard two things from him. First of all, I heard the word charter schools for the first time. That was absolutely the time it was introduced to me. But what I also heard was that the districts could take their customers for granted, that there was no motivation for districts to do anything new or innovative because their customers came to them simply because they moved to a certain zip code. So there's no reason to change anything if your customers are there by virtue of living at an address. So that was really important to understand how he was approaching this. But then the other thing that I heard, which was really important, was that this was all about empowering teachers. Now, remember, I was a union endorsed Democrat, a teachers union endorsed Democrat. The union leader of the state lived in my district. So I thought, wow, this is a great way to serve one of my constituencies. So Shanker talked about how teachers at their recent AFT convention were actively seeking better ways to produce more learning for students by using different methods and technologies and human resources. He was working to find ways that teachers could be a consistent part of making innovation an ongoing and valued part of the school community. He wanted to find ways that the larger system, could partner with teachers to encourage risk-taking and change. So what I heard was not only was this an opportunity for teachers and for students and families, but it was a way to expand opportunities for teachers. So remember, and this goes back to another little bit of history, his reaction to a nation at risk in 1983 was to embrace it by defining teaching as a profession, which was pretty momentous. That's part of his visionary look, if you will. Before that, unions were thought of as blue-collar unionism, if you think about like the UAW, United Auto Workers. At that time, male heads of households got paid more than single women teachers. It wasn't very equitable. So instead, he wanted to make teaching a truly professional model. He proposed a voluntary national certification system that would certify teachers as outstanding veteran practitioners in specialty areas, just like the medical profession does, allowing them to earn more pay as they got more expertise. So bottom line, it seemed that all of this would motivate the changes that the public was demanding in our schools. More opportunity for kids, more opportunity for teachers. And he was truly leading the way.
What I find fascinating about that is the vision he had, the time he had it, and then the backdrop of a nation at risk. And I want to enter in Ted Coldry, who's somebody very special to the Founders Library and to the influence he's had on each of our lives and his thinking. But Ted was at that Itasca task force. He drove Shanker to the airport. They've had lots of conversations and exchanges that are documented through the Founders Library. But that idea that you had to challenge the givens and change the incentives was really critical to that. And so, Don, I want to invite you in to take us up from that. Why, with all of the push of a nation at risk, was everybody still frustrated with the district's inability or unwillingness to change?
Districts are built for a purpose, right? Districts are built to democratize public education, to provide widespread access, to provide consistency in programs. By their nature, they're not necessarily flexible or innovative in order to get the results that people want. In the transition, really the pivot that we were seeing in that 1980s period, late 1980s period, was how do we become more flexible, more nimble, more responsive for the needs of kids? So, if you look at the idea of chartering in phases, Budde proposed chartering as a way to allow teachers to take more control, more authority over individual existing schools. Shanker proposed innovating within the district structure. And where Coldry comes in is he proposed a really radical idea, and that was allowing for chartering to occur outside of the district by the creation of new schools that were independent of the district model, to be able to try new things and do new stuff for kids. And that's really a big pivot, because once you get outside of the district model, you become freer to be able to try new things. And also, districts don't have much of incentive to charter new schools within them. They're an institution built for one thing, and charters is fundamentally different. So that's really the big advancement that Coldry had made, was allowing for chartering to occur outside of the district. Also, unlike Budde and Shanker, who kind of put the idea out there just to see where it might go, Coldry was the one who really pulled it all together and worked with great people like Ember and others in Minnesota to form it into a bill and help get it passed and enacted and implemented in law.
In fact, Ember, you talk a little bit about this almost task that you have. You've learned about this concept called chartering. And I think in the book it mentions some folks even laughed at the term, like they really didn't understand what it meant. It was still very abstract for a lot of folks. And then in your involvement with beginning to write this legislation, I imagine you were tasked with also defining, like, what is this charter school? What is chartering really? And so what was it like trying to define this concept and really get it on paper for public understanding?
Well, first of all, Ted Coldry was just a visionary himself, and he was the intellectual behind all of this. And so he and the Citizens League took the notion of a number of different elements and brought it to our Senate Council and said, draft it. Can you imagine that? Draft it. Okay. And so, but she did. We'll talk about that again. But the bottom line is that it was very tricky and it was very difficult to do because the charter proposal by Shanker was based on the premise that it would occur within the existing school and the existing collective bargaining agreements, like Don was saying. He's talked about sub schools, if you will, but not outside the district. Okay, it was under the district umbrella, and when you have existing collective bargaining agreements that cannot be broken because the union did not want to break them, that's fundamental to unionism. It locks in so many elements like budgeting and hiring and firing teachers and curriculum and structure of the school day. So there was very little room to move, to create innovation or change and still keep the collective bargaining agreements. You need independence or you need autonomy to try some new things. So it was like you wanted to try these new things, but your hands were tied. And that's why Coldry was saying, well, we got to go outside the district structure and outside the collective bargaining agreement. And as the chartering discussion proceeded, it was clear that Shanker was looking at this notion of staying within the collective bargaining agreement. And that is where we diverged. So that's where his vision and the vision of Coldry and me and others in Minnesota diverged. We were looking at creating schools new. There was a big difference in that. And finally, it's funny, even Ray Budde came along to the charter idea as new schools rather than existing schools after he talked to Ted Coldry around 1992. So the key thing we needed to succeed in our legislation, and we did get, even though it was severely compromised, was to separate chartering from the collective bargaining agreement in the district. To do that, we needed to make severe compromises that I mentioned that I thought would never allow a charter school to happen. But fundamentally, that was the key that did survive. And we did say that the school itself could have their own agreement with their unions and their administration, but that they didn't have to be under the district agreement. So that was a very key difference that separated our visions.
One of the things I really admire about Ted and those early thinkers is, we often hear this saying, think out of the box. They truly thought beyond the box of the district. And to do that in the time at which they did that really was groundbreaking and has created a movement that has sustained for 30 plus years now.
Jim, and it's interesting, it has sustained for more than 3 decades, but it was also going back to Al Shanker. It was something that early on he he decided just wasn't going to work. The what was being implemented in Minnesota. I'll read you a section of a letter that he had written to Ray Budde on the issue. And the last paragraph of this letter reads, "In the final analysis, I don't think that this or any other structural reform will work. That is, improve student achievement unless we get agreement on standards, curriculum frameworks, assessments based on the content, and accountability for students for their performance. If we had that, as every other advanced industrialized nation does, then charter schools, as you described them, make sense. Diversity tempered by common standards and decentralization disciplined by the public interest." But yeah, just early on, just as we were getting going, that's when he decided that it was enough for him, and our paths kind of diverged in that way.
And part of the reason that happened too, Don, is because he was the head of a national union and he had a whole lot of locals in the states. And the local leaders were saying, "What are you doing? We don't want this." And so he had to also react to his own constituency. They thought that he was a step ahead of them, even though we had reformer educator leaders in Minnesota like Louise Sundin and Sandra Peterson. They were thinking, we don't really know what he's doing here.
Yeah, that's right, Ember. Everybody's got a mortgage to pay.
Well, beyond the politics and the pragmatic issues of people, let's talk for a second about his idea that you need to have standards and you need to have tests and you need to have accountability. Those three things are coming under a lot of pressure right now. Was he right then? Is he still right now? What's the evolution of the thinking of standards and testing and accountability?
Well, I'll just start out by saying that early on, there was a big difference in Minnesota and other states in that regard. Most other states, after a nation at risk, said we need more standards, we need more, and that's how you have accountability. But our Governor Rudy Purpich, thought differently. He said, no, you need more incentives for opportunities, more incentives to do things differently. And that's why he had proposed open enrollment, which would allow students to transfer to another district if a district wasn't performing or meeting their needs. That was an incentive to motivate districts to respond. And so Minnesota was always very different in that. And then they had post-secondary options, where high school students could take college courses at the senior and junior level. And again, motivating districts to say, well, I guess we better compete with them. We better have a better curriculum here to keep our students. So standards was not the key for Minnesota, even though it was a lot of other states. And that's what made us different. And I think that's how chartering was able to emerge in Minnesota versus another state.
Don, knowing you're a Hillsdale grad and you're working on your PhD at Wayne State, I almost heard Ember talk about the invisible hand.
Sure is a lot of that in the charter movement. And it's really interesting because we've spent a lot of time talking about, Budde and Shanker and Coltree and their path toward charter schools. And there's a whole separate stream of thinkers who have really grounded their thinking in the market as well, of what can we do through chartering, through choice, through autonomy to bring in market-like pressures to increase quality for students overall. So that's something that I hope that we get to talk to later in the season. But one thing that strikes me about that passage from Shanker is how similar it really is to that conversation we had at the National Alliance Conference with Ashley Berner at the Institute's event. I'd encourage listeners to read her books. She just has a very different and international take on public education, whereas in most countries, public education is not like we think of it here, where it's education that's provided by the government, but rather it's education that's publicly funded and accessible to everyone. And what differentiates schools, what makes a school a public school, is being held to some standards and some set of accountability and getting high quality results for kids over time. So I just think it's really interesting how two people with two different approaches kind of arrive at the same thing, that we need some basic standards and we need to hold schools accountable for them in order to really get the results that we want.
Which brings us to our next piece, is the Citizens League report. And Don, as you just kind of eloquently introduced, we have these two seeds planted, kind of arriving at what will become chartering. And this is going on in Minnesota, right? And so we've got this group of thinkers, business leaders, educators, government officials, all coming together, not really to write a manifesto, but to write legislation. And the vehicle was through this, what I call think tank. You guys have to correct me if I'm wrong on that, but the Citizens League. And so I'd like to come back to that. I know Ember's already kind of introduced to us earlier what the Citizens League group was, but let's talk about this report. What role did the report play in bringing the charter idea forward?
Well, the report was pretty revolutionary in many ways. There's, if you looked at three things that it brought to the discussion and changed fundamentally the entire nation's thinking about the delivery of education, it was autonomy, that it wasn't a building, it's the process of schooling that would differentiate a charter school. Autonomy. Second, that teachers and schools should adapt to children's needs rather than require children to adapt to the standard system, right? And so, again, turning it upside down. And thirdly, the Citizens League said we needed to do things better, and that necessarily implied boldness to do things differently. So those were the three things that really the Citizens League was known for. But I'm going to take it one step here. Remember, I said they were not a partisan organization. They were not ideological. It was outside the traditional political structure. That's important because most new ideas for legislation come from defined interest groups who have an agenda. But there was none of that here. It didn't come from a governor who usually sets the tone for a legislative session. It didn't come from legislators. It came from the outside. It came to me from the outside. And sometimes the most important thing that policymakers can do is step back, remove the barriers, and let citizens take the lead. That's what the Citizens League was doing. And they were doing it well. And then they framed it so we could draft it with our Senate council into a proposal for the legislature to consider. We need more of that these days. We need more outside ideas that are not driven by partisan politics to come forward. But the Citizens League was Exhibit A.
There's so many lessons in that, right? When I think about us as leaders and some of you out there that are policymakers and school leaders and authorizers, there's a lot to really take in for how we can use that and contextualize it today.
Ember, you've got a foundational book, Zero Chance of Passage. And in that, you talk about the impact of the Citizens League and how they actually did months of homework, research, and actually didn't just give you a set of ideas. They helped turn it into draft legislation that could be passed and implemented. Will you talk to us about the importance of that and put it in context of how do you get things done legislatively, not just then, but today?
Well, as you said, they actually laid out some key policy elements in the report around those principles that have framed chartering today. And those principles included things like they were public schools, which obviously is a discussion point today, that they were subject to charter revocation if they didn't perform. That whole accountability piece was new. A school could be closed if it didn't perform. They said that the charter school must accept all students of all academic achievement levels. No tuition could be charged. They had to be non-sectarian. They had to meet accreditation standards. And licensed educators must operate charter schools and get the other kinds of benefits, like students would get transportation aid. So all these things were laid out and taken to our Senate counsel. Betsy Rice was one of our best staff members at the Minnesota Senate. Ted Coldery took it to her and had to convince her to write it. He said, this is going to be a new form of public education. So he said, well, these aren't public schools. And then he said, but it's a form of public education that an entity other than the school district could deliver public education. she kind of looked out the window and she said, "Oh, okay." And then she wrote it. So,
Wow.
I mean, you had to even convince the lawyer that this could be done. And so she wrote that with those policy elements that I just talked about, and tried to instill in the law that autonomy that was critical to the Citizens League report.
And Don, why do you think this report gained traction when others didn't? What was about the context or the time that can help us understand the movement?
Sure. So in politics, the right solution at the wrong time is the wrong solution, right? So Poultry was not the first, as we talked about, to think about chartering, to think about charter schools. A lot of other people before had thought about more site-based management, greater autonomy, tried it with, thought about it and talked about it within the district structure. Ted's innovation was going outside of the district structure, and he was also able to, with Ember and others, to align up kind of the policy with the politics and the framing of the need for reform in response to a nation at risk in a state that was already ripe for choice. As Ember mentioned, she was the sponsor. I believe you were the sponsor of the open enrollment laws too, right, Ember?
That is correct. Yes.
So Minnesota was already a state that was ahead of its time, ahead of others in providing more public choices for students. So this, in a lot of ways, was a real natural extension on that. But in order for it to be implemented, the policy and the politics had to be lined up. And Ted and team were able to do that in a way that nobody else was able to do that to that point.
I'm going to get ready to close us out because this has been such a deep, reflective moment and a dive into the foundations, right? We're just getting started, listeners. This entire season, we're going to take our time and walk through the chartering movement. But today, we really went back to the roots and where the concept and the idea of chartering began to evolve. And it sounds like all these thinkers were bold by choice way before we became bold by choice. And they had really strong and bold and innovative ideas and really awesome ways of galvanizing multiple people so that the process really began to meet the function in reshaping education. A couple takeaways I'm leaning into, and then Jim, I'd love for you to share takeaways that you're leaning into. One for me is chartering didn't start as a national agenda item per se. It started with local people. And Ember, I love how you said it actually came from the outside. And so sometimes maybe we have to think about that too in the roles we're in today. Who are the folks who have different vantage points that may be really, really key? The story of chartering is a story of everyday people and everyday leadership. And I find that really inspiring. My second takeaway is every document, every vote, risks taken. There was a lot of boldness for some of these speakers in the early and late 1980s to make some of these statements. And those risks taken in the early days have really shaped what our K-12 education environment, our school choice environment looks like today. But the work isn't done, to Jim's point earlier. We've got a lot to think about when we think about student achievement in 2025 and beyond. And so the work isn't done. It's just changed forms.
Vashanta, I think there's so many leadership lessons in this story, but one of the most fundamental is we get trapped in paradigms. And the ability to look beyond the paradigm of the district box to something beyond the district was so foundational. And it's still part of the argument today, quite frankly, that somebody besides the district can educate, serve, and receive public funds to educate kids is still pretty right at the heart of the challenges and the conflicts that we see with chartering. Two, I love Ember's story of I cried. And now she's, a national hero from my view, but so often as leaders, we do things and we can't tell that they're going to work. In fact, we might have think we've failed. And yet it's persistence, it's fortitude. And it's also the idea that our team's bigger than ourselves. The story of Ted Coldry, the Citizens League, bringing them into the legislative arena, bringing their ideas and the combination of having a broader based team the way we think about it. I even think for schools, like, do the schools see the students as part of their team? And if they do, and the parents are part of the team, like, what more can you accomplish? The business community. So I think thinking about your team more broadly, and I've got a challenge for our listeners. And it goes like this. If you're listening and now you know your roots, chartering wasn't just about flexibility. It was about so much more. And if you understand that, what are the givens that you can challenge today? What are the questions about why do we do things? And it's not just to be disruptive, but it's to find breakthroughs, to find better ways, to find paths forward. Because chartering is a promise. It's not just a policy. It's not just a process. It's a promise. And it's a promise that we prove together. And the more we can be bold by choice and create great things for kids and families, the better our states, our schools, and our country is going to be.
Well, friends, next time on Bold by Choice, we are going to continue our journey through the charter movement's timeline, looking at the national expansion, the waves of both celebration and criticism that followed. So make sure you hit subscribe and share this episode with someone who needs to know how it all began.
And this isn't just history, it's a call to lead boldly. And we're just getting started. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. And as always, stay bold by choice.